thank you very much for coming to those lectures. I think it's an important topic, and it's very important that we gain the overall understanding of the key challenges all people face at this moment in history. The security situation is only one of these major challenges. We've got also enormous existential threats and challenges coming from environmental degradation and climate change. I won't talk about it, of course. From the demographic shift, which results in aging population and increasing pressure on all institutions which provide services, not only for the aged, but also health services, due to the shift in the nature of morbidity factors. That is fact that more and more of us, before we depart to a better world, will suffer from dementia, and this is very difficult form of not illness, because there is no cure for it. It's a chronic situation. The third big challenge are uncontrolled migrations, which wreak havoc everywhere around the world, and in particular in Europe and America. It results in a political backlash, which is even more dangerous than the migrations themselves. And we've got also the fifth rider of the apocalypse, which we face, the inevitable coming of pandemics and viral pandemics involving viruses, the entities which are not really living organisms, and therefore we know very little about how they spread and how they multiply using the human carriers. And we know, and we are warned, that it's not a question whether, but when. And most of us, I talk about countries, states, are still woefully unprepared for those forthcoming existential challenges. So let's get back to the security challenge, in particular the war and the prospects for peace in Ukraine. It's extremely important, in spite of the huge distance. This tyranny of distance does not protect us from feeling the impact of the war in Ukraine, and will not protect us from feeling the impact of a peace in Ukraine, whatever this peace is. And this will be the topic of my final third lecture. So let's focus on it with the purpose of understanding why they pose such enormous challenges. Why did we have this conflict seemingly far away in distant Ukraine, and very few people even knew before it started where Ukraine is, where it's located? Why is it so important and consequential? And my explanation involves three elements. First, that this is a very important, crucial conflict because it marks a reorganization of world superpowers, and in particular, it's a stage of fall of the largest and most powerful empire in history, the Russian Empire, which tries desperately, under the leader, neo-imperial leader, to prevent, or at least to slow down, this collapse of empires. The empires have to fall. We have no history of successful rebuilding of empires. We have history of the new empires entering and their expansion. But empires fall for two major reasons. So Russian Empire faces inevitable deterioration and fall, and therefore the inevitable conflicts and wars, such a fall, such a fragmentation of empire, which change either in Commonwealth, that is voluntary association of nations, or independent nations. Okay? Usually both to some extent. But two reasons for it are, first, that they involve not only domination of a people, but also redistribution of resources from the peripheries of expanding empire to the center, and all problems of maintenance of mechanism of this pumping the resources from the peripheries to the center to feed into the administrative hub, which is located, in case of the Russian Empire, in Moscow, since about the 9th, 10th century. These costs are economic, administrative, military, and the costs of maintenance of ideological bonds which empires have to develop to maintain this very fragile, huge, and expanding entities. And at certain point of time, these costs overwhelm the empires, like the Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire. We know, everyone did some courses during education which explained that at some point it's too cumbersome administrative machine, too expensive an army to maintain, and also economically exhausting, because the empires have to provide bread and circuses to the, especially to the center. And at some point, they can provide only circus, but not bread. And the Russian Empire finds itself in this situation, that the standard of living of Russians starts to decline. The costs of maintaining the big controlling machine become too high. The economy of today's Russia, the largest state in the world, the largest empire, is only 20% larger than Australian economy. Think about it. Think about it. And it has been growing at a much slower rate under pressures which is beyond the scope of our lecture. The second reason empire inevitably fragment is the development within that, especially at the periphery, of nationalistic movements. Movements of national liberation, as they are very often called. They are most powerful movements in history. Nationalism is the most powerful ideological force in modern history. Irresistible. It's irresistible because it appeals to sense of identity and dignity of people. They are no longer ready to be proud of being, like in the case of Russians, if they feel that they are Ukrainians or Belarusians or Georgians. And if they cannot feel with dignity Ukrainian, Georgian, or Belarusians, they will start to rebel. especially if they have cultural tools of rebellion, if they can, in a sense, to revoke histories of their independence, past independence, autonomy, separate language, which is suppressed by empires, and some peoples, like the Irish, lost its own Celtic language almost completely. It's recovering regionally, but it doesn't play a role of such a big source of dissatisfaction and longing for independence and autonomy like in Ukraine. Ukraine has its own well-developed language. It's very different than Russian language. It's much more similar to Polish. It's a Slavic language, but it's much more similar to Polish language. And the educational system in Russia managed to suppress this language for a very long time, for about a century and a half. But in the western part of Ukraine, it survived, and they want to speak their own language, cultivate their own culture, and this very powerful movement becomes more and more difficult to suppress because people are living their identity through this movement, assert their own identity, what they really are. And in addition, in case of Ukraine, they managed to detach their own belief, religion, from the administrative rule of the Moscow Orthodox Christianity. They have their own priests now, Ukrainian priests, which give them different message of faith than old Orthodox Russian priests. And this combines into a movement for which people are ready to sacrifice their life. Only nationalistic movements have this enormous power of appeal, which result in people feeling that their life is less precious than the cause for which they fight. Okay, and that was lecture one. I was trying to explain how those two forces, the growing costs of maintaining empire and impoverishment of the center, which starts to suffer all sorts of dysfunctions related to overextension. In sociology, we call it imperial overreach. And from the other side, they face growing movements of national liberations which cannot be satisfied by a sort of imposition policies which very often imperial leaders try to follow, namely telling them, you are not really Ukrainians, you are confused Russians. And they develop their own institutions, like in Ukraine, especially in Western Ukraine, under the Habsburg Empire, in which they develop their own literature, their own national aspiration, poetry, songs, and they try to live the life of dignity even under the imperial rule, but long for separation or meaningful autonomy. Now, so this was the story so far. Now we are moving to the second explanation. There is a second aspect of the war in Ukraine, which we have to stop and explore for a moment. It involves the key actors. So we talked about processes of imperial collapse. Now we are talking about leaders, the key political actors involved in these processes of war. And today I would talk a bit about three actors. All three are collective actors, although I'll give them the name of leaders because they are at the same time leaders in a political sense of the states. Nevertheless, they are surrounded by groups of elites, power people. Around Putin formed a group which he himself shaped to a significant extent, which are called in Russian siloviki, that is the strong people, uniformed services, mostly the army, police, border guards, but all uniformed services have at their head key decision makers who are very strongly loyal to Putin. He formed around himself this very powerful, loyal machine which is run by subordinated Putin's elite. Around Zelensky formed a very powerful, very interesting Zelensky's elite, which consists partly of the ex-oligarchs, which were very corrupt. They turned their ways and start to support the Ukrainian cause, and new people, new elites, which Zelensky selected mostly from nationalistic movements, but also the newly formed military elites. But the power of Zelensky is to a large extent due to the fact that he is so charismatic leader who managed to get a remarkable support from the European Union and from America under the democratic administration. Okay? Now this support has been collapsing, and we'll talk about the third actor, the new Trump elite, which emerged not really in 2016, but may I suggest that Trumpist really elite emerged only last year with the new victory, electoral victory of Trump in America. Only now Trump can realize the full spectrum of his agenda, political agenda, which is terrifying. Terrifying, which is interesting, very dangerous, because it's completely different American set of policies from his predecessors, much more similar to imperial American policies under the last 19th century President McKinley. It's anti-globalist, it's anti-European, it's very heavily anti-liberal. In many respects, it culturally represents the shift away from the common values which fed the Atlantic Alliance. Okay? Europe and America and Canada were glued by the set of common values which are questioned now through Trumpism. So three actors, three sets of elites around them, ideological, political, military, technological, like Mr. Musk, and we have to look at them and see how they influence the nature of the conflict. But next week I will focus on the nature and trajectory of peace. All conflicts ends either by surrender or by victory or by some sort of arrangements, and we will have a good understanding of where we are going in Ukraine if we look at the prospects for peace in America, not only the shape and trajectory of conflict, but also for the future prospects by looking at the activities and mentalities and the way of thinking and the ideological constructs of those key collective actors. So let us start from the first actor, and more difficult to understand, Putin and his elite. It's more difficult to understand because Putin denies that he is an ideologist, that he has particular commitments. He changes his view very often, at least makes statements which are contradictory. So many people say, well, I don't think Putin has any ideology. He's an opportunist who uses ideas to build up his support and power. I think to some extent it's true. But if you are a leader of the very powerful empire fighting for its integrity, fighting for its survival, you have to use ideas. You have to use ideology, which I would like to define very simple as a vision of good society derived from one or more key values, plus the strategy how this vision can be realized. So liberalism is a vision of good society derived mostly from the value of freedom, liberty. Other values are sort of subordinate to this main value. Good society is free society, according to liberals, and the best way to achieve the strategy of building liberal society is through reforms. Okay? Overcoming mostly conservatism, which is inherent in our nature. We want all to maintain the old ways because they are dear to us, because they become routines. As one philosopher nicely said, people don't fight for their interests, people fight for their lifestyles to maintain continuity and sense of existential security which such an attitude gives you, okay? If things don't change too fast, we feel a bit more secure. Socialism, another ideology around the value of equality, core value in socialist ideology. Good society is society of equals, not free, but equals. And other values need to be in some way squared with it, which is impossible, but ideologists work very hard to square other values around the core value. And the strategy pursued by socialists to reach this good society is through revolution. Now, the type of ideology Putin started to embrace, which we will refer, for the absence of better label, as Putinism, is a form of neo-imperial conservative ideology. As you may remember, Putin first was a KGB agent, very committed communist, socialist, But he discarded those views at the point where they broke down and the whole Soviet Union machine and its ideology collapsed, and start to condemning the leaders of the Soviet Union. Lenin, when they reported to him, it's a scandal. The Ukrainians are destroying the monuments of Lenin. Putin said, very nicely. I would like to help them, because they didn't represent the proper commitment to Russian values, including religious orthodoxy. So it has very strong conservative overtones. And he declared that his general dream is to return Russia today, Russian Federation, to the state of Tsarist Russia, Imperial Russia, under Romanovs, especially Alexander the II. At the time when there was no Poland, no Ukraine, no Belarus, no Baltic states, where Russian influence went deep and was exercised in the imperial way. That is, the rule was both political and spiritual, social. The same Orthodox Church, dominant, religious commitments to the values of subordination, which, as we explained last week, came from the Byzantine tradition, Caesaropapism, as they call, where the head of the church is the same as the head of the army and the state. So roles might be defined differently, but it's in one person that these three rules combine, form of ruling. And he said, yeah, we do not need to return completely to the Tsarist Russia, but this is our dream and aspiration. And of course, because Putin is not a great thinker, never was, he has his favorite court thinker, Alexander Dugin. He is the most famous, and I limit my explanation of this vision, Putinist vision, because it was articulated in the most clear way in the writings of Alexander Dugin, D-U-G-I-N. You might have heard about Dugin. He was called the brain, Putin's brain, for a while. There was little faith in Putin's own thinking device, and he wrote a very influential book on the principles of geopolitics in the 1990s, which Putin started loving. First, Putin was critical of it, but he developed the love and commitment to the vision of Eurasian empire, reborn, but reborn even better than the Russian Empire, because it was the new imperial vision stretching from Dublin and Lisbon in the west to Vladivostok in the east. So, few words about this Dugin's vision, so you understand why it had such an appeal and became so important in the war in Ukraine. Because Dugin, of course, condemned Ukrainians' rebellions and all the claims within the empire, this Euro-Asian empire, as a form of heresy. Not just ideological deviance, but heresy. And his book became the compulsory readings in the all in all Russian military academies, okay? Putin prescribed this reading as compulsory reading. He wanted everyone to make familiar. But even more interesting is the very last book. Dugin produces book after book after book with new message, and the last one published at the beginning of this year is very interesting, and I have to explain you why it's interesting, because it's an interpretation of what he called Trumpism. The title of the book is The Trump Revolution, the Trump Revolution. And it's almost exactly like a vision of Donald Trump. Dugin, who wrote the ideological blueprint for Putin, was capable of writing an ideological blueprint which supporters, which the Trump's elite would love to have. No American author wrote such a good interpretation, exactly how Trump would like to see himself and his role and international relations. This is the reason, so I explain. So first, few words about Dugin's original imperial vision. Eurasian empire, which should triumph, should triumph, and which should extend its borders over Europe and Asia, is a necessity, geographic necessity, derived, Dugin here is very much like Soviet ideologies before, like Marxist-Leninists who said that it's not ideology, it's a scientific inevitability, which we can prove scientifically. He says, all great empires are built around common civilizations which have their center, and the center is always in the territorial heartland. Therefore, he called it political geography. Where is the heartland of the Eurasian Empire? Of course, in Moscow. You would be surprised to learn. But it's such a big and complex empire, which is inevitable, according to Dugin. All history gives premium to empires, has to take into account its internal diversity. So it's an empire, of sub-empires, and three such sub-empires, which are ruled from Moscow through hegemony. Very important term. Hegemony refers to form of political ruling which is exercised ideologically, so they have the common ideology, and which is exercised also in domain of politics through a hierarchy of subordinated political entities. There might be independent states, but subordinated through hegemony to the core. And there are three of them in his vision. One is Berlin, in Berlin. He's very mindful of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact of the 1930s, and the common claim that there are very similar forms of ideology, Nazism and Bolshevism. They differ only in the way they treat nationalism, but they have a lot in common. They are collectivistic. They reject the notion of individual rights. They are only collective rights. So first is Berlin. Second is Tehran. Here the bells started ringing He thinks that Eurasian empire should extend over part of Islamic territories too, but Islam should be subordinated to core religion, which is Orthodox Christianity. Okay, Orthodox Christianity. Alexei, the patriarch of the Moscow Orthodox Church, loved this vision. And the fact that Putin says, if you live in such an empire, you have everything. You have sense of security, sense of belonging, sense of identity, but you have to be Christian Orthodox first, Russian second, and human only third. Music to Putin's ears. This vision had many details. It was very strongly anti-liberal and condemning the Western liberal, democratic, individualistic form of thinking as heresy, not just deviation, plain heresy. And it followed this vision of imperial power providing spiritual unity over the whole civilization which the empires represent, cultural entity, religious entity, political entity, that it provides also a sense of conservative security. It's always to be. He rejects this notion that empires rise and fall. This empire, and he quotes here the 14th century Orthodox monk, is to be is the third Rome. Moscow is the third Rome after original Rome, Byzantine. It's the third one. And he adds this sentence, which is very important. I have to say it in Russian because it cannot be translated. And четвертому не быть. And the fourth one cannot be. Cannot ever be. So Moscow is a third Rome, the final, the end of history, okay? Empire. History will end because it would settle all the problems. And the fourth one will not be. This grammatical form, those of you who know Russian, do we have anyone understanding Russian? Yeah. Четвертому не быть. How to translate it? It's a very characteristic, no other languages have such a form.
It's very definitive.
Definitive.
It cannot be.
It's much more that cannot be. It's impossible to be. So this vision had enormous appeal because it condemned Ukrainian claim and rebellion for independence, not only independence, but detachment from the Russian Empire and joining European, Western Empire as a most dangerous form of confusion, heresy, which should be burned out. These people have to be defeated and eliminated. He is also casting doubt over the notion of re-educating. They should be sent away or killed. Okay? So condemnation of it in the language which Putin found very attractive. You remember he was saying in between around 2008 in Munich meeting famous, no Ukraine, no Ukrainians. Okay, we are all Russians. Some of those Russians are a bit confused about their identity, but we are all have to be Russians. And the very dangerous part of Dugin's activity, which in my view resulted in the death of his daughter was very strongly following and his views, and Dugin started to appear everywhere. He was invited to America and was talking to audiences of both neocons and Trumpists in America to considerable applause, because he says American civilization can live in peace next to the Euro-Asian civilization. This argument in America was very well received, especially among the neocons. First, he said, religion is very important. We are, above all, Christians. You are Christians, slightly different Christians, but you are not our enemies. If you are Christians, you have to reject all these movements of gender liberation, gender equality, liberal ideas gone, music to their ears. And he said he was referring to a very, very crucial idea which appeared in America in the 1990s. So I make a slight digression, but it's very important to understand this importance of the idea that we are moving from nation states to pre-nation state versions of some sort of empires, which was spread in opposition to globalization movement by a very influential, very clever American political scientist, Samuel Huntington. He wrote first an article which made huge impact, and then the book called The Clash of Civilizations, first edition 1991, in which he argued that the wars, that history does not end, we enter a new world of wars which will be on the boundaries not of nation states but major civilizational circles. He distinguished 9 such civilizations and said in 1991 already, in fact he wrote before that, before the fall of the Soviet Union, beware of conflicts which happen in the Middle East because they are on the boundaries of different civilizations. And I'll show you this. And other conflicts between states are not important, but civilizational conflicts in the future will likely to be very important because they are impossible to settle. They are not political conflicts. They are civilization in the sense that they reflect very different belief systems, values, cultures, and such conflict you cannot settle. And he was arguing against a very optimistic thinkers like Fukuyama in America, who wrote similarly influential article, The End of History, and who predicted that we are becoming so similar to each other that globalization will settle the problems, and the future is settled more or less around the notion that liberal democratic model and liberal values are universally valued. Therefore, we have the end of history. We reach realizations where all countries can abandon major conflicts, or there might be conflicts about minor things which are easier to settle through diplomacy because we reached a state. And Samuel Huntington said, no. Expect the big wars on the boundary between the Orthodox civilization developed in the imperial Russia and the Western Europe, which is very, very different. It's also Christian, but non-Orthodox Christian. Okay? Expect the conflicts around the boundaries between Latin America civilizations and Northern American ones. Not easy to settle. Not easy to settle. Expect conflict in Asia. China represents very different civilization. And on the boundary between China and non-China, you will have inevitable clashes of civilization, the title of this book. Now, that was a digression. We are coming back to Dugin. Dugin was very different than Samuel Huntington, but he also claimed that wars are inevitable, but instead of this 9 civilizational circuit, he erased the difference between light blue and dark blue. He says, yeah, it's a one civilization. Eurasian is one civilization, and therefore there will be no problem in forming unity. And with this message, he went to America and was welcome. And now we are coming to his latest book, recent book, this year, The Trump Revolution, which I summarize you only in a few words, because we have to go quickly. He says that Trump represents the future. Suddenly, he says, we welcome the American leader who realized that this hostility towards Russia is misplaced, that we have to live together, move from unipolar world dominated by America in its liberal ideology to multipolar world which respects other civilizations and will not try to dominate them. We have to live in a new world, and Trump understands that. He will regard the conflict in Ukraine as internal conflict within Eurasian empire, which we are building, and will not interfere. He's not interested in it. It's beyond American interests and beyond Americans' concerns. And Trump is, above all, changing America. It's a revolution from liberal America to anti-liberal America. From America in which he calls it the woke culture, creates the new issues and division, to America which goes back to traditional values, which eliminates divisions over other political. So this book will be a big hit in Trumpian America, I predict, and you will hear the name of Dugin again and again, because he articulates also the notions which are so close to Trump. It's good time to move now to Donald Trump's. That in America there was a ruling cabal, conspiratorial group. He calls it the deep state. Dugin says, absolutely right. There was a hidden deep state in America, and Trump was first to convert the state from accepting liberal ideology into new outlook, Trumpism, which suggests that America should withdraw into the defense of its lifestyle and interest, abandon Europe, and start to maximize its gains. And he says, I knew that the corporate world would appreciate it in America, and he says, Elon Musk is my hero. He understands too that for the new American empire, it's important that the power of major corporations and politics become dominant, that you abandon any attempt of dominating over others, involving yourself with conflicts on the other side of the world, like in Ukraine. Leave it to us, we'll settle it, and without your interference the world would be better. And therefore, appearance of Trump was such a gift to Putin. He obviously said at the beginning, defense of Ukraine, which was traditionally in American a part of a mission of leading the free world. Okay? The values of liberty, human rights, as central to America, he abandons it and says America has to defend its economic interests above all, and domestically should move from liberal value configurations to much more collectivistic form of nationalism. Trump hit obviously a very important point in America. Many Americans probably have always thought like that. Many Americans probably felt uneasy about the new mission of America of being a leader of the free world. If you live in the Appalachian Rust Belt, you probably say, well, I'm interested in having good standard of living, safe job. Do I care about the human rights being violated in Myanmar or Ukraine? No, I'm not interested. This isolationist feelings have been strong in America. They were over the last post-Second World War period overwhelmed by more idealistic commitments of being the free world defender and acting as a policeman of the liberal order in the world. That is, order based on shared rules and agreements. Agreements are important. You don't break agreements. Otherwise, we come with a big stick on you. This notion is rejected by Trump. He says the might is right. We come into pre-1945 period of history, period of rule of law, international rule of law and agreements. We come to the world where naked power is important. By doing it, Trump abandons what Americans and we all call soft power of America. Soft power is a power you have due to your prestige, to your standing as a defender of certain central values. Okay? America was respected by everyone in the post-Second World War as a major fighter for those values. Trump ended it. We are back to pre-1945 period. The might is right. You don't need soft power. People need to fear you. They don't need to admire you. America sacrifices the soft power in such a obvious and surprising way. I don't understand why you can reject this influence. So the peace, I will talk about it more next week, the peace will be determined in a new set of circumstances international, where the might is right, rather than the rules are right. Therefore, Ukrainians are so uneasy about guarantees of their security. You have to provide it in the form of strong military might, and they demonstrated they could resist the Russian army so effectively. So if the peace results in disarming for a second time, first disarming of Ukraine happened in 1994 when all the powers, US, UK, and Russia, stripped them of the nuclear weapons on the promise, on the reciprocity that the territorial integrity will be secure. Now it sounds like a joke. And Trump, by saying, we are not feeling obliged, Ukrainians should not oppose the Russians. They are within Russian sphere of influence. Makes a sudden and very painful break with American policies. He also breaks with this NATO alliance, Atlantic alliance, and that will affect the nature of peace which will be emerging in Ukraine. And two words, final, Zelensky. Zelensky is an interesting leader with loads of charisma. That is ability to generate loyalty of the people who feel in him, in his action, the major things they cherish. Okay? And he managed to project such a very charismatic image and very charismatic form of commitment. Now he's standing in Ukraine, paradoxically, when he was confronted by Americans in Washington 2 weeks ago, very high. He has, again, his approval hit the new height. And that makes him a very powerful defender of the Ukrainian independence. But he will have against him not only Putin and the might of the aspiring Eurasian imperial power, but also Trump's elite, which is not interested in securing, giving any guarantees. The guarantees Americans claim Ukraine would get by giving access to its mineral resources to America are illusionary. Because Putin would give Americans the same access in exchange of quashing Zelensky. So it will be very, very interesting process now. We'll have a test of Zelensky's ability to represent the long-term interests of Ukraine and the free world. Free world in which we lost the leader. American president no longer declares himself defender of the free world. He says to Europeans, you defend it yourself. He alienates his closest neighbors, especially Canada. It's amazing. And I don't know how the Australian future would look like. Is AUKUS meaningful in this under new conditions? Those are the questions we'll have to face, and we'll talk about more next week. I apologize that I took so much time, but if you have patience and curiosity, I'm happy to answer a few questions.
stunned.
Pardon?
I said, we're all stunned, you know.
Yeah? We should be. Yes. First then, and then you. So first, gentlemen.
Could you comment on the fact that in Ukraine, the Ukrainian army seems to be having a problem getting recruits? And what impact will that have on Ukrainians' position in the negotiations?
Yeah, in 2013, Ukraine had about 45 million. Now, people now has less than 40 million because it lost more than 5 million of refugees which escaped, and the war has heavy toll. So it's a small country and will always have to compensate for the absence of human power. Women are also in the Ukrainian army, they perform a very important role, by technological advancement. And they adjusted to that very well. I'm told that they are the major producers of drones, fighting drones. And they are the best producers of sea drones. So we should admire Ukrainian speed with which they made this shift. But Russia has about 140 million inhabitants. Military service is restricted mostly to the non-Russian and non-Moscow and Petersburg people. So they first release all the prisoners as the fighting meet, and then the research showed that Asian minorities were drafted much more frequently. So they could take very heavy casualty, estimated now at about between 600,000 and 800,000. Yeah. Now we are in the domain of speculations. I apologize. But the speculation I was informed about is that it was not his daughter who was the target. It was Dugin himself. His daughter happened to be in the car at the wrong time. And the major reason for killing Dugin were his very good contacts in Iran. He established very strong foothold of Putin's Russia in Iran and was the author of this arm transfer, especially Shahid drones to Russia, which made certain Middle Eastern very strong countries very uneasy who also share the view that Iran is dangerous, and the secret services decided to get rid of Dugin. Domain of speculation. Pardon? Dugina. No. She was killed. The bomb was planted under his car when he sent his daughter instead of going by the car, and they suspected a woman. Very few international services use women. So again, the pointer in certain direction, and she escaped to Estonia. And we don't know what happened to her. She was a nasty piece of work too. I don't defend terrorism, I think it's terrible. but it hit a person who was extremely active in providing the links, digging the link with the Islamic world in Thrice Caucasia, and it was even in many ways even more radical than her father. Yes.
Dugard's analysis about talk with Orthodox Russia and Russia, does that mean there's going to be a delay in populating Eastern Siberia? Because it seems like the focus is on the West.
Very interesting question. Siberia became a big issue together with Arctic for simple reason that Russia is economically exhausted, and Putin made a big mistake in his past by putting all his eggs into a single basket of developing Russia through mineral wealth, exploiting mineral wealth, and especially relying on gas and oil. In the world which is moving away from carbon fuels, it was an unfortunate decision. And therefore it was so easy to break Putin's dominance over energy market in Europe by pointing to the opportunities for developing renewed forms of energy. But now the big threat, I watched a short film about, it's a fantasy, about Moscow being mindful of Siberian independence movements. There are some independence movement, you hear about them, because Siberia is a source of enormous mineral wealth, and also a threat to the environment, because the permafrost in northern Siberia, when it thaws, sends back to atmosphere enormous amount of the most damaging greenhouse gas, which is methane. You first, and then gentlemen.
I think it's fascinating. You were able to confirm or deny something I've recently heard, that with Trump no longer supporting Ukraine, he's denying access to some images that Trump gains through Pine Gap here in Australia.
I know nothing about it.
It rings true to me, but
I only listen to our very rogue senator who says we should send Americans a bill for Pine Gap in exchange for their tariffs. Yes, sir.
Apologists for Trump, pieces for Trump, if you like, tell me that NATO promised Putin that they would not push borders to the border of Russia. And they say, well, really, it's understandable what Putin is trying to do, trying to get buffer zones to separate himself from powerful West, which doesn't seem quite so powerful anymore.
Yeah. I don't think NATO can, as an entity, make promises whether to expand or not expand over European territories. It only sets conditions of membership in NATO, and Ukraine would not be able to enter NATO in current situation and in the distant future, because one of the core requirements for membership in NATO is that your country has no territorial disputes with your neighbors. So the reason for which Zelensky used this NATO, we would love to be in NATO, it's a wishful thinking. It's very, very, very distant future, okay? When finally Ukraine emerges in whatever shape without conflicts with all the neighbors' territorial conflict, there it would be possible. But he made a very important point that others' security guarantees, other than NATO membership, have proven inefficient. It didn't work. Zelensky does not believe in promises which are based on signature on paper, because he knows that in the current world, neither Putin nor Trump are ready to respect such agreements. Trump already said, I don't recognize the famous point 4 or 5 in NATO arrangements obliging countries to take part. Although Europe respected this point when entering American wars after September the 9th event.
Is Putin justified in his fear about NATO? I think that was the previous question, essentially. He uses the argument we're fighting defensive here because NATO is encroaching on us. We're ready to invade. Is that justified?
I don't think there is a good answer. I should honestly say I don't know, because he made statements which indicate that he is ready to respect NATO force and obligations, provided that they increase their military budgets. And he made clear statements saying, no, I won't defend anyone, even if they are in NATO, if they not pay their dues. So, which Trump is a real Trump? We don't know. Unpredictability of Trump is a big problem.
My question is about Putin.
Putin. Putin agreed in 2007. He said, I don't mind. Until 2007, he used to say, I don't mind NATO at all. Okay? He said, I don't mind if any members of the Commonwealth of Independent States, this funny name he gave to countries, would join NATO. And he was offered the status of the associate in NATO, which he appreciated. Suddenly, from 2007, from the infamous Munich agreements, talks with Europe, he said, no, NATO is dangerous, I don't want NATO, and I suspect that he uses it simply as an argument, bargain argument. I don't think anyone should be or could be afraid of NATO in the current sorry state the association is. I think I tested your patience sufficiently.
Thanks, Tim.